Hey, what's going on, everybody? Luke Marino here, East Partnership. Welcome to our first Life Cycles Live in like a month. I took a month off because you guys were exhausting me. Now we just had a bunch of travel going on. We had SMRP, a couple of other conferences. And speaking of SMRP, I was able to meet up with Mr. Tom Moriarty. And so I feel like this is like a double treat for me because I got to hang out with Tom 2 weeks in a row now. So how you doing, Tom?
Yeah, great, great. It was a great time at SMRP. Got to see you and Bob Latino, Hank Kosovar,
Yeah.
bunch of other folks. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it really was. I had a great time, and it was pretty cool to be able to go out there and just catch up with everybody, and it was like somewhat return to normal. Although it was a little different this year than normal. I'm chalking that up to you got to break the ice somehow. We had to get back out there and get going. So next year,
Yeah,
Raleigh, October, it's going to be great. So
yeah, and like I said, I give a lot of props to the staff from SMRP to stay with it and not cave and cancel it again. So I think it was fantastic. Even though it wasn't 1,200 people on site, it was still over 500, and it was still pretty good.
yeah, yeah, and we had a workshop that you were unfortunate enough to have to sit in the back of the room for a while because no one else would let me
Oh,
hang
that was
on.
fun. It was really fun. It was very informative. It was really good.
Anytime you get to hang out and learn from Bob is it's like a gift for me. Uh,
Yeah.
he's just so good at what he does. But yeah, so like we're gonna jump into this because this is something that I've been really excited about continuing. Tom's doing a series with us on the productive leadership system. And for those that didn't tune into the first episode or tune into the episode before that, where we just hung out with Tom and talked business and engineering and all kinds of crazy stuff and Coast Guard sea stories, he wrote a book. It's called The Productive Leadership System, and it's fantastic. And so everyone wanted to hear more about it. We brought Tom back for a series on the different like top themes from the book. Oh, upside down.
Upside down.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. That's what it looks like. And
Yeah,
for the bosun mates around, there are plenty of pictures in there. So
yeah. Any toys fall out of it like when you shake it? No.
no,
Um,
no toys.
yeah, yeah, it's great. And although Tom's down there in Florida braving these fall temperatures, he was kind enough to take a moment out of his golf game to come talk to us about another chapter in the book. So
Yeah, temperatures dipped into the upper 80s. It's really bad. Nighttime into the 60s though, so it's really nice right now.
yeah, that's pretty sweet. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little jealous, but well, I won't say I'm jealous yet. I'm gonna be really jealous in about 2 months. I love the fall, but man,
Well,
in January,
in 2 months we'll be on chapter 4. So
there you go. Yeah, I can rib you then. By the way, how many chapters are in the book?
five. There's
Oh,
5 chapters plus a bunch of appendix information on. Well, the paper that I did presented at SMRP was on the leadership survey that I did with Plant Services Magazine. And I lay out in there how to do the team effectiveness survey and the motivation portion of the survey.
wow,
So, yeah,
very
giving
cool.
it away.
Yeah, just giving all the good stuff away. That's awesome. And yeah, I was excited to learn a little bit more about your survey last week when we had some time to talk. So it sounds like you guys did a lot of hard work to get to that point. So that just builds confidence in the content of the book outside of the subject matter itself and your extreme expertise and experience in this field. And being able to wrap all that up and apply it in written word to something that's usable for the reader. There's another layer on top by you incorporating that study and its results. Pretty cool.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's what I really tried hard to do in the book is to make it practical, make it so that anybody with, if you have just a little bit of leadership experience or no leadership experience, you can pick up the book, read through it, kind of understand all the concepts, and then start applying it. And it's written as a leadership book by an engineer, And so as I looked at it, I went to first principles on things so that I built everything up from the ground. And that's really what this chapter 2 was about. We talked about chapter 1 in the last segment, and that's kind of like that was a chapter on why is leadership important, and what's the value for putting leadership best practices in place. Chapter 2 is about those fundamentals. How does the brain work? What's so special about our brain? How does the brain work, and how does that apply to leadership? And I've got some slides that I'll go through. It's a truncated version of what I would present during some of my leadership workshops. So let's see if this works. And,
it should be live on the screen now. I can't wait to learn about my brain.
Okay. Oh, great. Well, I talk about the gorilla brain too, so you might be a hybrid. I'm not sure. We'll find out.
Are you able
okay, so this is.
Are you able to see the presentation?
I see what's. I see the presentation. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so this is part 2 of the book, chapter 2. It's called Our Brains, and why do we need to understand about our brains? Well, leadership is getting things done through other people. So we can learn throughout our lives. That's one of the most fundamental things about our brains. That means that as leaders, we can learn new behaviors and to be better leaders. And also the people that we lead can learn new behaviors based on the way that our brains function. And so we can learn how to create an accountability-based system. We have to be able to communicate and support the right behaviors. And then the behaviors will become habits, and habits become the culture, and we'll go into that. And when we do that, we're able to get things done through other people, and that's kind of the essence of what productive leadership is. And so we'll talk now about whether the human brain is anything special.
I say yes.
Yeah, I think so too. And as I was researching things for the book and thinking about how am I going to go through this chapter, I came across a TED Talk called What's So Special About the Human Brain. That was by Dr. Susanna Herculano Herschel. And her claim to fame as a scientist is that she had come up with a new method for being able to calculate how many neurons were in different animals' brains, including humans. And so she compared human brains to gorilla brains because gorillas are the closest cousin to humans in terms of their brains. And so a little bit of mathematics here. Our human bodies consume about 2,000 calories per day, and about 1 billion neurons across any primate, about 1 billion with a B neurons, requires about 6,000 calories per day. And through Dr. Herculano Herschel's research, she determined that human brains actually have about 86 billion neurons. And so that means that they consume about 516 calories per day. And human brains are about 2% of our body mass, but by this calculation, they consume about 25% of the total energy that our bodies consume. Gorillas, on the other hand, their bodies are much larger. They consume about 3,500 calories per day. Again, the same 1 billion neuron require about 6 calories per day. And gorillas have about 30 billion, only about 30 billion neurons. And that means that they consume about 180 calories per day. So much less than human brains. Gorilla brains are about 1% of their total body mass and only about 0.5% of the total energy consumption. And so humans have greater neuron density, which means more neurons packed into a given volume. And therefore, our cerebral cortex is also larger. So there's greater density means increased capacity for memories and reasoning. And our cerebral cortex in humans is about 16 billion neurons. And this is by far the biggest of any primate. Gorillas have a lower neuron density and a much smaller cerebral cortex. The lower density compared with humans means decreased memory and reasoning. And their cortex, their cerebral cortex is only about 5.6 billion neurons. So and they're the largest of any non-human primate. So when we think about primate brains, why do humans have larger brains than gorillas? And the answer is the energy balance. So gorillas are primates with large bodies but smaller brains than humans. Gorillas are about 2.5 times the body size of a human. Those large bodies consume a lot of energy, requires a lot of calories. Gorillas spend 8 or 9 hours a day eating raw vegetation. Now, raw vegetation has very low nutritional content, and it's much harder to digest. More time and energy is spent for gorillas searching for food and consuming food, so they have less time and energy available, even for complex thought and reasoning. Humans are primates with smaller bodies but bigger, denser brains than gorillas. And so humans have about 2.5 times the brain size of gorillas. We organized, we cultivated food and got more nutrition from the food by cooking it. And cooking food makes it easier to digest, and it yields a higher nutritional value. And so that leads to more rapid brain development. And we have less time looking for and eating food, more capability and time for cognitive reasoning. And I always say I'm really glad that that's the way things worked out. And I'm kind of rifling through this because I know, people are going to be able to go back and, start and stop this as they go. And I want to leave a little bit time left at the end for questions.
Absolutely.
So now we talk about neurons, right? So we talked about 86 billion neurons in the human brain. So what are neurons? Well, they have 4 parts. They have a cell body, and that's basically the portion of the neuron that is responsible for the life function or the sustainability of the neuron. There's things called dendrites, and these are tentacle-like projections from the cell body. And typically there's about 10,000 dendrites per neuron. Then there's a thing called the axon, and there's usually only 1 axon per neuron. And this is what transmits the signals from the cell body to the terminals. And then, of course, we have terminals. And these are the connection points at the end of the axon for making connections or synapses with the dendrites. So this is how you make kind of an electrical connection. So the way this works is the dendrite releases an electrochemical substance called a neurotransmitter. That terminal of an adjacent neuron connects with a dendrite to form the synapse. And then the electrical signal transfers from the dendrite to the terminal through the axon to the cell body and then to the next dendrite and so forth. So when you're learning something or when a thought process is going through your neurons, that's how the connections are made. Now, there's 2 different ways that neuron connections are formed. There's DNA-based and experience-based neuron connections. The DNA-based are about 17% of all of the neuron connections, and those are formed by the time that we're born. And these cover biological functions like breathing, heartbeat, your nervous system, and digestion, those sorts of things. But they also form the neuron connections that enable our sensory functions, our ability to see, to make noises, to feel and touch, to smell, to taste, etc. Now, experience-based neuron connections are different. About 83% of the neuron connections happen through the interactions with our surroundings through our sensory connections. Happens every moment of every day over our entire life. And these sensors pick up information from the environment around us. The brain then filters and processes that information. And so an interesting consequence of this is that young people have much greater neuroplasticity, meaning it's easier for them to learn, but older people have a greater volume of memories, which means it's easier for them to process thoughts. So it's kind of interesting. So the basic structure of the brain are those neurons. So those neurons now form different portions of the brain. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. The first is called the hippocampus. And this is specialized for processing sensory information. It allocates experience-based memories to temporary storage areas within our brain. And those are called short-term memories. that temporary storage may later be converted into long-term memories. And the other thing that the hippocampus does is it generates sort of a coding scheme for new sensory data. And it acts kind of like a database index or a file compression dictionary so that the brain knows where to retrieve memories from. And the way this encoding system works is that it supports efficient, compact, and organized information storage. A couple of other interesting parts of the brain. I mentioned when we're talking about human and gorilla brains, I talked about the cerebral cortex. And this is a part of the brain that's used for complex and focused thought. Remember that I said that this consumes a tremendous amount of energy. The majority of our brain energy is consumed by the cerebral cortex. The other important part is a thing called the basal ganglia. And this is a part of the brain that recognizes patterns and it runs sequences or routine behaviors. And it recognizes patterns and runs sequences, and it consumes very little energy. This is important. Between the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia, this is why it means that our brains are designed, they're actually try to create habits. And habits are run through the basal ganglia. It's kind of like running a routine or a subroutine in a computer program. It automatically happens. And when that happens, we can be doing things with our basal ganglia that frees up the energy resources of our cerebral cortex to be able to do more complex thinking. And so the idea here too is that if we didn't have a basal ganglia, we'd have to relearn everything every time we did it. The basal ganglia allows us to put it into routine so we don't have to think about it. I always use the example of when you drive home from work every day and you pull up into your house or your apartment, and if you've got a designated parking spot, you're normally pulling up within about 2 or 3 inches of where you left the day before or that morning. And on your drive home, you're not thinking about how much force to put on the steering wheel or when to hit the gas or the brakes. It's just automatic. And while you're driving, 9 times out of 10, you're thinking about something else. You're thinking about your kid's soccer game or something going on at work, but your brain is on autopilot. The basal ganglia is in control of the routine activity of driving home.
I swear I used to black out on the way home.
Exactly.
How did I get here?
Yeah, but like if a dog runs out in front of you, you snap out of that routine and your cerebral cortex jumps in and, you hit the brakes and all that stuff, right? Yeah. So as long as the routine is run without any interruptions, then you don't have to think, you just do. So short-term memories, right? So now every fraction of every second, our senses are collecting all of this information. And so the hippocampus then breaks apart all of this sensory information into specialized subdata. And things like color, vertical lines, horizontal lines, slanted lines, spacing, audible tones, movement, all of these things are categorized by the hippocampus and stored in specific parts of our brain. The other thing it does is it filters out important from unimportant information. So that's why, I don't know if you've ever seen these videos of like people throwing a ball, and you got people in white shirts and black shirts, and they're throwing a ball, and you're asked to watch how many times the people in the white shirts pass the ball. So you're focused on counting that, right? So that's where your brain is focused on. And someplace in the middle of that video, somebody dressed in a gorilla suit walks through the middle of the people throwing the ball, and you never see the gorilla. It's because your hippocampus is filtering out unimportant information. So to you at that time, you're focused on the ball being passed around. You're not focused on the gorilla walking through the scene.
So does this say something about people that are easily distracted? Is there something with the hippocampus development?
Probably so. I haven't looked into that, but probably so. And I'll give you an example of how the brain, how the hippocampus basically decodes things. If you think about the letter K, right? There's relative proportions, the spacing in and around the letter. There's a vertical line, there's horizontal slanted components, etc. That's all subdata, and every intricate piece of it is stored in some different part along different neuron paths. So it's really fascinating. And the other thing is that different but similar types of subdata, just like if you had a different font for the letter K, that will be subdata stored in a different but adjacent neuron sections. So it's really fascinating how the brain does stuff. So all new subdata is recorded as short-term memories. And that's very important because short-term memories are unstable. These are the initial synapse connections that I talked about are very weak, and they only linger for a few seconds to a few minutes. In some cases, you can extend a short-term memory for maybe a few hours or day, even a couple of days. But if there's still a short-term memory, they're still going to be unstable, and they still won't be converted into a long-term memory. And so anytime you attend training, for instance, even though you load a lot of information into your short-term memory, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. That information will be lost. So the short-term memories, there's ways that you can convert short-term memories into long-term memories. But a long-term memory is something like this. Do you remember what the name of this equation is? That's for you, Lucas.
No, I don't. I block all traumatic experiences.
A squared plus B squared equals C squared. It's the Pythagorean theorem, right?
Pythagorean theorem, yeah.
Right. So most people remember that.
Well, this tells you how backwards I am, because last week someone asked me, they were trying to find something in advanced statistics, and I said, "Oh, you're talking about X," and they were like, "Yes." And then you put this
you pulled that right out. Well, the things that you learned in high school or grade school are probably some things are still locked in there. So you kind of blew this point for me, but most people understand this to be the Pythagorean theorem, and it's locked in because why? When we were in high school or elementary or junior high school, whenever we learned it, our teachers showed it to us. They showed us how it worked. And then they ran problems, and then they gave us problems to work at home, and then they checked our work, and then we had quizzes, and then we had tests. So it was what's called spaced repetition.
Yeah,
and if you do that often enough, then it converts a short-term to a long-term memory. So why should we care about memories? Well, short-term memories are created before long-term memories. You can't get a long-term memory without it first being a short-term memory. There's one exception to that rule that I'll talk about. Long-term memories are required to execute learned behaviors. So our behaviors, the things that we do, other than, say, an automatic response like pulling your hand away from a hot stove, most of the behaviors that we do are long-term memories. And so learned behaviors performed consistently become habits. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how habits are formed. And so when most people exhibit the same habits, that's when we get a culture. That's when, those are the way we do things. And so productive leaders can create direction and guidance that defines the right or the desired behaviors. These can then be observed. We can be attentive to those behaviors. And then we provide feedback. We're being assertive to provide feedback so that we establish the desired habits and the desired culture. Now, when I talk about habits, this is, again, where we are moving things from the cerebral cortex into the basal ganglia, right? We're changing it from that high level of brain energy consumption to the routine low energy, right? And so studies have been done, and they use rats a lot because the rats' brains kind of mimic the cerebral cortex and basal ganglia behavior in humans. So what they do is they have a very simple maze, like this T-shaped maze. There's a gate, and then they put a reward in one corner. And so they place a rat behind the partition. They put the chocolate or the reward in the right place, in the same place all the time. They then raise the partition. The rat smells the reward, and it starts searching for the treat, right? The reward. and it eventually finds it. Well, once you do that, you repeat that same test dozens of times, but you always leave the reward in the same corner. It makes the rat change from being a learned, in the process of learning, to actually being a habit, because they know exactly where that reward is. So we can observe the behaviors, we can reward complying behaviors and correct non-complying behaviors in humans to kind of gain that habit, to try to force that habit into being. And so what happens in the brain, if you look at the left side here, this is the initial maze run. This is what happens in the first few iterations when they raise the partition and the rat goes out and starts looking for the reward. On the right side is what happens after, dozens and dozens of maze runs. And so if you look at these center positions here, you'll notice a big difference. And this is where the control shifts from the cerebral cortex to the basal ganglia. Now, when you look at these patterns, you'll notice there's still a spike in the beginning and a spike in the end. These are the brain waves, because when the click of the partition goes up, that's when the rat senses the cue to put it into that routine. When it's running the maze on its way to the reward, it's not thinking anymore. It knows exactly where it's going. And then when it gets the reward, the brain activity goes up again. So it's a really good example. And this is the same thing of what we refer to as the learning curve, right? It takes a lot of iterations before it becomes second nature.
This is why I think everyone should buy my classes 5 or 6 times before they.
Perfect.
I'm kidding.
I'm not. So remember that what I keep saying is that culture is what most people do most of the time. What people do are behaviors. And so to get the right behaviors, we have to define the right behaviors. Then we have to be attentive and assertive in guiding the right behaviors. And so when we guide behaviors, we guide behaviors by giving positive and corrective feedback. And if we guide the right behaviors, over time, we get the right habits. And then when most people have the right habits, that's how we get the right culture. So I always laugh when I hear all these different things about culture change and all these different techniques and methodologies. This is basically it. This is what they all boil down to. And so behaviors become habits, right? So remember I said repetition, when we keep using exercising those neuron connections. Repetition is the best way that we can embed learning. There's a couple also, a couple of other things. There's called pattern hooks, and there's 2 types of those pattern hooks. The first is where you put yourself in a similar situation. And so that's like if you're doing computer-based training or flight simulator training, those sorts of things, you're like immerse yourself in the same situation. So it's easier for those neuron connections and the hooks of similar information to get to be solidified. There's another form of pattern hooks where you essentially use multiple senses. So like when you're learning to drive a car, you're using your touch on the steering wheel, you feel acceleration and deceleration in your back, in your seat. You're hearing blinkers turning on, maybe you're hearing car horns honking at you. You're seeing relative speed from inside to outside of the vehicle. All these different senses are being integrated, and those create pattern hooks as well. The fourth way, and this is the one I said can sometimes go directly from a neuron connection to a habit or to a long-term memory. That's when you witness a traumatic or an emotional event, right? Something like you're walking down the street and there's a car crash happens right in front of you, right? Those sorts of things will lock in a long-term memory. But these other 3, space repetition and the 2 pattern hook processes, are the ways that you can strengthen neuron connections to convert from a short-term to a long-term memory. So when you first start repeating it, the first few iterations, the brain is working really hard, just like the rat in the maze. With repetition, the connections become stronger, the behaviors have less variation, and then the cerebral cortex eventually hands off the routine to the basal ganglia. Their sensory inputs are de-emphasized. Remember, when you're driving home from work, you're thinking about other things, so the sensory inputs on what you're seeing ahead of you as you're driving and so forth, they're de-emphasized. You're still seeing them, but they're not front of brain. You're using less brain energy, and then the basal ganglia recognizes and manages these patterns. And this is there's a book called The Power of Habit by, I think it's Charles Duhigg, and that's where that rat maze example came from. And this is his process when he thinks about a habit cycle. It's a cue, a routine, and a reward. So you can think about it that way. The other interesting thing is that once a habit is established, it never goes away, right? And so you think about people that maybe are abusing their break time or something like that, or they're coming in late. If that becomes a habit, you can correct them, but they still may revert to that habit. And this is just the example of learning to drive or driving on your way home. But the thing about old habits and new habits, like I said, old habits are persistent. They're not erased. And people can and will revert to old habits when they think the payoff is greater than the probability of consequences, right? The probability of consequences. And when they perceive that the old habit is better for them than the new habit. So how does a leader ensure that people don't revert to old habits? Pretty simple. Be consistent and attentive to watch for the right behaviors, and then be assertive to correct non-conforming behaviors. And I'd also say that, you should also provide positive reinforcement. When you see people doing the right thing, that's probably one of the most overlooked things in leadership, to let people know that you see them doing the right things. And then again, make sure that you provide consequences when there's intentional non-compliance. So the person knows they're doing wrong, but they're going to keep doing it anyway, right? That's when, you have disciplinary policies and so forth that kick in. Communicate the reasons why the right behaviors are better in the long term, right? So remember the two things: the payoff is greater than the probability of consequences, and they perceive the old habit is better for them than the new one. So if you can communicate why the reasons why the right behaviors are better for them in the long term, you have a much better chance of keeping them from reverting. So creating the right culture, right? So if we want to use brain science to create the right culture, we have to create and enable the right behaviors. So we need to communicate direction. And when I talk about direction, what I mean by that is mission, vision, values, and objectives, right? What is our purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? And then communicate the performance standards. And those are usually found in guidance, things like policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. And of course, you have to provide the assets, the training, and the support needed to carry out the direction and guidance. And then remember that repetition of the right behaviors creates the right habits. And, positive and corrective feedback guides behaviors. And the right behaviors become the right culture. And so habits happen when the behavior control shifts from the cerebral cortex to the basal ganglia. So when we're trying to get those right behaviors, that's what we need to focus on. So just a couple of important things to remember about our brains. Our brains are something special. We should understand and leverage our brain's capabilities to improve ourselves and to be better leaders. And remember that humans can learn throughout our lives. So you can learn new things, and the people you lead can learn new things. So that means we can define the behaviors we want others to execute, and then we can observe whether they're following those desired behaviors or the right behaviors. And then we have to be consistent, attentive, and assertive in giving positive and corrective feedback. And then behaviors performed consistently will have that shift between the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia, and will create the habits. And then the habits that the leaders guide or allow dictates the culture. So that means if you allow habits to form that are not aligned with the direction and guidance that you want, then you're going to get behaviors and habits that are not aligned. And so that's kind of the presentation. So we can get into some questions here or whatever you'd like to do next.
So I find I was putting two and two together while you were on that last slide about developing behaviors, establishing culture. One of the things that I have heard from managers, I'm intentionally not using the word leader and I'm using the word manager, is
Got it.
Because I don't know if they're good leaders or not, right? I know they're a manager, but I don't know if they're a good leader until I get to know them a little bit better. But, they're worried about investing in people, investing in people's development. And I always found that kind of interesting because in one hand, people would say, well, you could ask them, how do you feel about the culture? Could it be better? Sure. How do you feel about production? Right? Is your team perfect or could they do better? Oh, of course they could do better. Everyone's, normally like, yeah, we haven't reached our pinnacle yet. But the willingness to take certain action to get them from where they are now to where you really want them, I think is interesting. Like the return on that investment, right? Like how much time do you spend providing people with an opportunity to learn at work away from like that routine production type stuff? It's interesting to me.
Yeah. So on that note, what I tell people is that, when I talk about the productive leadership system, it's more than just leadership skills, right? Mm-hmm. Leadership skills are things like time management, communication, giving and receiving feedback, empowerment, conflict resolution, right? Those are skills that you need to know to be able to be, marginally capable of carrying out your role as a leader. It's, the old phrase, it's necessary but not sufficient, right? So the main thing here is that in addition to those leadership skills, you need to understand what your role is as a leader. And I talk about, and this is getting into chapter 4 stuff, but it's related here. So leadership roles are how you spend your time as a leader. And there's 5 of them. One of them is to be an expert technician, which as a leader, you should be doing very little of that. The second thing is manager administrator. You should be doing probably 30 or 40% of your time on that. Coach is the third one. You should be spending 30 or 40% of your time being a coach. And then a few percent as a systems thinker, basically looking at your internal processes and procedures and relationships with peer organizations to make things run smoother internally. And then there's visionaries, the 5th one, and that's where you're looking at things from outside of your group, opportunities and threats that are coming from outside of your area of responsibility. So maybe there's a change in regulations, maybe there's a new plant manager coming in. Maybe there's new technology that you might be able to deploy, right? So it's looking down the road and anticipating things. But then there's also leadership attributes. How do you carry yourself? How do you, I talked about being consistent, attentive, and assertive. There's also motivational and respectful. And there's 5 of those. If you arrange them the right way, the first letter spelled karma, right? So it's kind of the characteristics or the attributes that you present to people that you interact with. But then there's also, you have to learn sources of power. You have to understand what motivates people, and you have to understand how to set goals that are motivating, right? So needs theories and things like that. So there's this whole ball of wax that you have to put together. And so when you start thinking about, developing others, that's the reason why there's a span of control, right? So a supervisor to 8 to 12 direct reports in their shop, right? So you get to learn your individuals, and the leadership survey that I did with plant services, it showed that about half of people never want to become a supervisor. You know, I'm talking about the hourly workforce. They never want to become a supervisor. They just love being a tradesperson, and that's what they want to do. So that's great. As their supervisor, you should be developing them in their skill set, in their trade, or the trades that they want to be doing, right? So, for instance, if you're a millwright and you want to be a PDM guy, right? Okay, let's find opportunities and cross-train and do that to develop that person there. The other half of people, some want to be a prospective leader or supervisor in the near term in less than 2 years. Others see themselves maybe going to that route, you know, sometime in the future, but not now. Right. So for those two groups, the ones that are thinking about it in the next 2 years, that's where you should be focusing your leadership development time to bring those people along. So as there's an opening, they're already pre-prepared to go into that leadership position. If you wait until they get promoted into that leadership position and then start training them, they can do a lot of bad things, you know, a lot of things that are counterproductive to morale and to good leadership, right?
Yeah, could be a lot of damage.
Yeah. So especially in today's market where it's very hard to hold on to employees and it's very hard to get new employees, right? So, you know, I've said this for years now. The best thing that you can do if you're a plant manager is go into Glassdoor and look at what people are saying about your company. Because if you think you're having a hard time attracting candidates, maybe there's a reason why. Maybe your leadership team isn't presenting the right stuff, right? They're not taking care of their workforce. They're not. Maybe there's too much bureaucracy, micromanagement, all that kind of stuff. Where something like being a productive leader would allow you to have a better staff that would have a better workplace environment that would attract people instead of repelling them.
Yeah. Did you see James Anderson's question just pop up?
I did not.
Okay. So on the right-hand side, you should have a chat overlay. I'm going to put it up on the screen, but I'm not sure it'll actually show fully because of its length, but let's see what we can do here.
Okay, I see it. I can speak to these.
Now, Jim's an electrician. He was an EM.
Okay.
Is an EM. Still active duty Coast Guard. One of my guys on Tampa, just fantastic. Great human being, hard worker, proud of his trade. You know, just a great all around shipmate. So good to see you again, Jim. Sorry I've been holding out on you for the last month, man. We had some things come up, so we weren't able to do the Life Cycle Live. So I intentionally took a couple weeks off of doing live, but we're back, brother. So good to see you.
Yeah, so I think he's asking about like watch standing, right? So when a new person comes on board ship or into a new position and they have to learn, I mean, when you get on board ship, you got to do your drawings. You got to, you know, you're running to try to get qualified as soon as possible to pull your weight and, you know, take the weight off of your shipmates who are standing extra watches until you get qualified, right? And so great question, James. To me, it still boils down to the same thing. So when you think about watch standing, there are job JQRs, right? Job qualification requirements. There's a listing of what it is that you have to learn. And there are, in the service, at least, there's a lot of documentation on what's the right guidance, right? The policies, plans, processes, procedures, and measures. So the idea there is to make sure people have access to those things so that they can read through, understand what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And then, you know, the supervisor, the people that are, and it might be a peer, right? It may not even be a supervisor, but it may be a qualified peer that's trying to work them through the process. Again, it's a matter of being consistent, attentive, and assertive. When people are doing things the right way, we give them positive feedback. When they're doing them the wrong way, we give them some corrective feedback, and we get them on the right path. And again, the more that they exercise those new learnings, the stronger that the those neuron connections get, the faster that they move through and convert short-term to long-term memories. And as they convert to long-term memories, that's what behaviors are based on.
Excellent. Yeah. And so he was talking about like iterating that every watch, right? Like you're learning, Jim, you could get crazy with this. It could be every round. Now think about how scary this is. Remember when your analogy about driving to work, where I was saying I was driving to work and I would like not remember half my drive home.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember having security watchstanders who would, you'd see them stumbling across the mess deck. They got the glaze on, they're just doing another round.
Yeah, it's because they had operations going on all night, and they were probably out on a boat going back and forth to a boarded vessel, and they get back in, got 30 minutes of sleep. Now they're on watch.
Yeah. Yeah, we appreciate that, Jim. We need all the help we can get. We're getting old and crazy. So, well, at least I am. Tom just keeps getting younger looking.
Stop it.
When we were in St. Louis, I was looking at him. I'm like, wow, he's aging well. Look, he's got all his hair. He's got a good tan.
Yeah, well, Florida helps.
Yeah. All that vitamin D down there.
Yeah,
man. That's awesome. So like so if you're in a position where you're trying to implement like a large amount of culture change, and you take the fundamentals of chapter 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you say, look, I want to put this in place so I can make this place better for other people. But in particular, just this one chapter's content, because I know we could pick from all across the book. Which, by the way, I did drop a link to the book in the comments, guys. So if you haven't seen it yet, go check the comments section. There's a link to the book in there on Amazon. I hope that's okay. So
absolutely.
So when you think about like, what can I do as a leader to take the lessons from today's session and implement them to make things better for my people? Like, what's the big takeaway?
Yeah, so for chapter 2, it's really about the leader themselves understanding how the brain works and what it's, again, first principles, right? Have a solid foundation on understanding how we go from giving somebody direction, telling them what it is that we're expecting of them. That just loads it into short-term memory, right? And so when you think about somebody learning any kind of a task, or any kind of a, norms for being within a shop, right? So clean your tools before you put them, special tools before you put them back, that sort of thing. Clean up your job area, right? All those sorts of norms. Anytime you're trying to teach somebody or get them to perform a behavior, the right way, that's what this chapter is about. It's understanding. I mean, I get into a lot of weeds about neuron connections and all that, and it might put people to sleep in that part, but I provided that because I want people to understand where it comes from and what parts of the brain are in control when, and how it is that, the cerebral cortex requires all of our attention, where the basal ganglia, things just become routine, right? And so I want you to understand that, and the idea that we go from, if somebody has to think their way through something that they're doing, and this is the classic learning curve, right? The first few times you do something, it takes forever to do it because you're trying to do it the right way. B, you're trying not to make mistakes, right? And you're trying to make sense of what you're doing. And so once all those things start coming together, now the next few times you do it, it's a little bit faster, you get it a little bit more, and it keeps going, right? That's all brain science. It's not, a learning technique. It's brain science. And so the idea that if you want to get your crew or your shop or your direct reports, so if you're a plant manager and you're trying to get your department heads to do something, it works at that level as well, right? So the whole thing is you have to explain to people what it is. You want to load into short-term memory what you want. And then by being consistent, attentive, and assertive, you keep guiding those behaviors until it becomes common sense, until it, that transition happens to long-term memory. And then you keep repeating it a few more times until it becomes a habit. And then once it becomes a habit for most people, that's how you create the culture. And that's kind of the essence of why I put a chapter on the human brain in this book, because it goes to first principles, and it cuts across any kind of if you want to talk about the ADKAR model or the John Cotter's models for change management, all of it revolves around getting brains to get short-term memories to long-term memories to behaviors to habits, habits to culture, right? It's repetition. It's repetition or pattern hooks. It's the way that you get short-term memories to long-term memories, and then getting the behaviors based on those long-term memories.
So this is the brilliance of boot camp, right? Like they take all of it. They're using
Yeah.
the trauma. They're using repetition.
Yeah.
They're using all of it. I love it.
Yeah.
That's great.
I'll never forget how to do a push-up. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I was really good at getting screamed at. I don't know if that's a skill I could put on a resume or.
Yeah, but you notice, like when you learn, marching, for instance, right? The first time you do it, everybody shows up to boot camp. They've seen somebody marching before, either in a high school band or, in a movie someplace or something. Yeah. So you kind of got the concept, but you're not real familiar with the commands, and you get 40 or 60 people all stepping off exactly the same way within about a week or less than a week, right? And you start doing all these facing movements and column movements and all this stuff, manual of arms. Doesn't take that long, but I guess that's another point, is that the more complex the task, the more complex the set of tasks that comprise the behaviors that you want, the longer it takes you to get it, right? So when you're learning how to march, you get very simplistic motions, just facing motions to start with, right? Get your spacing right, get your in the ranks, right? And then it's left face, right face, about face, at ease, attention, right? Very simple stuff. Once those are locked in, then you start getting the more complex marching, right? So that's another aspect to this. The more complex the issue is, the more time that you have to be consistent, attentive, and assertive in giving positive and corrective feedback.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I just love all this stuff, and I always felt like, especially when I got to be a little bit more experienced in the service, that the human element was at the core of everything leadership, right? Like you just couldn't ignore it. And this is literally talking exactly about that. And it's not about like manipulating people to think a certain way. It's about using the way people work, think, act, do, using and understanding that to form better relationships and function better as a team. And I think that real good leaders are involved in people. It's a people game. It's not a do as I say, kind of game. And I don't know, that it always baffled me that there were people who didn't want to take the time to invest in that, because they were like, yeah, I don't have time for that. I just need to do what I tell them to do. And
right.
Thinking, man, you know how much more effective the team would be if you actually took the time to invest in that and did it the right way.
Yeah.
So quick C
story. Exactly right.
Yeah, a quick C story I think is pretty funny, because it happened at the E5 level. So I'm standing in the chow line on the ship, and a couple of the E3s and the E2 decky types, they're just looking miserable. They did not like the BM1. They hated the BM1. And I'm standing in line next to this guy one day in chow, and these guys come up and ask him a question, and he barks at them, and they walk away looking all broke down. And he looks at me with this big smile on his face, and he's like, God, they hate me, and I love it. And he goes, I think he was joking, but he looks at me, after he says that, and he goes, why do you think that is? And I was like, well, it's because you're a hole, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What you tell them to do, because you have position authority, they're not invested
Right.
in you at all. Like,
No.
you wouldn't even have this conversation with them right now if you were a better
Right.
leader. They wouldn't have had to come ask you in the middle of chow. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is another point, right? When I wrote this book, I didn't write it to try to make people into a certain personality or a certain way that they have to carry themselves. When I talk about those attributes, right? Being consistent, attentive, respectful, motivational, and assertive, the karma, right? That's anybody can do those things, right? It's not to say that you don't have a gruff demeanor. You can have a gruff demeanor, or you can be kind of a softy. It doesn't matter to me, right? As long as you're consistent, attentive, respectful, motivational, and assertive, you can have any kind of personality you want. Same thing with your roles, those 5 leadership roles or the 5 leadership skills. Doesn't take any type of personality. This works for any personality. You just have to, be able to learn it and apply it.
that's awesome. Yeah, I love it. It cuts right through. It's fantastic. It's effective.
So I'll give you one quick story here from my long time past, when about a behavior, right, that has become a habit. And so years ago, I was working at on my off-duty days. I had a job when I was like a 3rd class. I was working at a boatyard on Cape Cod. And it was an old family-owned business. It was the grandfather of the, 2 guys who were like in their late 40s, who were brothers. It was their grandfather that started this yard. And in this yard, in the building, there was this great big pillar that was holding up, big wooden post that was holding up the roof and the place where the marine railways came up. And they had a potbelly stove, and every morning people would show up early to work, and you'd have a cup of coffee around it, and they'd be burning like scrap pieces of oak and mahogany and stuff. It smelled tremendous. But every day, Malcolm, the grandson of the original owner, would walk in. He has a black lunch pail, and he would, without even looking, he would just flip it up, and the handle would fly up, and it would grab this 18-penny nail that was on this big post. Well, of course, me and his nephew decided to mess with him. So we started moving that nail up by like a 1/4 inch every day. And after about 4 or 5 days, he comes in, he goes to throw the lunch pail up there, and it hits the beam and slides down, smashes on the ground. And he looks at it, and he looks up, and he says, I don't know. So he goes up and he purposefully hooks it now, right? And then he walks away. Well, that didn't stop us. We started going up another 1/4 inch, another 1/4 inch. And eventually he was coming in, and everybody sitting around the potbelly stove, the Franklin stove, we all knew what we were doing, right? What me and his nephew were doing. So they're all watching. So after a few days, he's coming in and he's jumping, trying to hook his lunch pail on this nail. And finally, he did that, and he was jumping. He had to jump like 3 times to get it. And he turns around, and he looks, and everybody sitting around the stove is doubled over laughing. And then he stops and he looks, and he sees all the little holes. And he chased us out of the shop.
Dude, that's great.
Oh, it was hilarious.
Yeah, but see, that's fantastic camaraderie,
Well, it's an example of a habit, right? That people, they won't give up that old habit.
I love it. I think it's great. Well, Tom, any I was going to say departing, any parting words, anything you want to pass before we close up today?
No, I don't think so. Just if anybody's interested in a training or workshop on a productive leadership system, give me a call. I'm still doing a lot of maintenance and reliability type consulting work. So if anybody's interested in that, give me a call. That's about it. You got my book listed there, and if anybody has questions or just wants to shoot me an email or a text or something, just let me know.
Awesome.
Happy to answer questions. And I still write that monthly column in Plant Services, and the well runs dry. So if you've got ideas on something you want me to write about, please give me a subject.
Did you hear that, Jim? throw a topic at Tom, and he'll write a whole article on it.
Stump the chump.
That's it. Stump the chump. No, that's great, Tom. And yeah, we really appreciate you coming back. I mean, I know you feel like, uh, any chance to talk about the book's a great chance because you worked so hard on the book and you just love to share it. But it's so educational for us, and I just love these sessions. And every month I look forward to getting you in here and talking about a new element of the book. So I really appreciate
Yep.
you coming out. And we've got Suzanne Greenman actually coming up on the 17th. It's going to be 30 minutes earlier than usual because we had some schedule conflicts, but 3:30 Eastern time, we're going to have Suzanne Greenman on. She's going to talk about change management and asset management, which is, really a lot of it's geared toward like if you're implementing an asset management program, the change management element's kind of unique. So yeah, we'll see if we can blend some of the brain stuff into it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I might be at a client location on the 17th, but if I can, I'll tune in.
Yeah,
And
tune in. It'll be
hey,
great.
my health and beauty secret is golf and good bourbon.
Well, I knew about the golfing thing because he was, yeah, I just, when things get rough, I'll just be like, you know what, I'm hitting pause and I'm going to go out and tee off. So what's your favorite bourbon? Do you have one?
Oh, I got a couple. Right now, it's been Gentleman Jack, so that's been good. But yeah, well, it's a whiskey, but I do like Maker's Mark, and I had some Whittle the other day. Yeah, so I get around a little.
I'm not people are going to slay me for this. I'm not like very well versed with bourbon, right? And I'm known for like not being shy about having a drink. So it's kind of funny because I just didn't grow up with bourbon drinkers. Like, we had like scotch and, of course, like one of my favorite all time drinks in the world is beer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, beer's for the in between bourbons, but I'm not not opposed to that.
I've got a bottle of bourbon at the lake, and we went to a friend of ours, and they had this. He goes, "Hey, you want some bourbon?" I said, "Sure." And it's a tall, narrow bottle, and it's got wings on it. And I'm trying to remember, it's Angel something.
Oh, that's a good stuff. That's Angel's Envy.
Yes, Angel's Envy. And
That's good stuff.
I was like, "Ooh, this is good." So I went and bought a bottle of it. So I can officially say now that I enjoy bourbon and that I have a good bottle of bourbon at home. But that's the only one I got. So
Yeah.
I'm a wannabe.
Yeah. Well, if you get a taste for that and you want a bunch of it, you better get a lot of consulting gigs.
Why is that like a thing with the price of bourbon going up or something?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the Angel's Envy is good. And at first I was like, because I immediately had a flashback to bourbon were we in Croatia or in the Ukraine? We drank it out of these like scabbards. They were like these glass scabbards that had bourbon in them. And I was thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. It was so good. I went and bought a bottle. So
yeah. Well, very good, man.
Yes, sir.
Very good.
Hey, thanks for coming back and spending more time with us, Tom. We'll get you back next month. Man, it's going to be December. Yep. It's crazy. So
how about that?
Yeah, we'll nail down a date for December, and we'll let everybody know. And I just really appreciate you coming on and hanging out again, Tom.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. And for those that are watching, we try to do this every week on Wednesday at 4:00 Eastern time. The 17th is going to be 3:30. And it's all brought to you by East Partnership. Check us out. And if you have any questions about the live stream or anything else to do with East, you can find me on any of these platforms that this is streaming on. Just reach out to me, let me know. And you can always get me at lucas@eastpartnership.org. Thanks again, Tom. We appreciate you, sir.
Hi, sir.
Everyone, take it easy. Be good human beings to each other. Bye.